Hello, I'm Edward Simmons speaking to you from just outside Atlanta, Georgia. And to those of you in North America, good afternoon. To those of you in India, a very early morning to you. Thank you for being up and being with us. I want to thank you for a kind introduction and for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to present highlights from my paper on big history as a philosophy of history. This presentation, as I said, hits highlights in the paper in order to stay within the time limit, and also hopefully to make it a little more interesting to you. The main thesis is that big history is in fact a philosophy of history, but that it has an undeveloped area, neglects spirituality. This picture is from Arches National Park in Utah, and it's a famous picture of a hole. You see sky through it. This is symbolic of what I hope to point out, not because I have solutions. I'm going to point in directions. This is an area in which I hope to contribute in the future. But the starting point is to establish that it's a philosophy of history. We will look at components and comparisons of philosophies. We will look specifically at Hegel and Karl Jaspers and big history as represented by David Christian. We will see some examples of um, images that are drawn from the professional historian John Lewis Gaddis and from Hegel and Kuhn of forward wanderers based on a painting by C.D. Friedrich, Night Seeing Owls, the Owl of Minerva, and backward paradigm shifting in Thomas Kuhn. We'll also take a look at highlights from axes of history as proposed by Karl Jaspers, and then taken up more recently by Karen Armstrong, who is a historian of religion and now a religious leader in the movement called the Charter for Compassion. We will then look at big history and the whole issue of emergent properties and an emergent God. Christian and others talk about the emergent properties of growing complexity. Nancy Ellen Abrams follows that same logic, but she says that we can see God emerging within the complexity that is taking place. And then we will conclude with a quick look back to see what we have accomplished and have in fact we identified a whole. So here is the quick comparison of the components of a big history. I'm not going into detail, but there are 5 major things that it does. And here are some questions that each of these components seek to answer. It must provide a scheme for organizing and interpreting history. So first of all, philosophy of history covers history. What we see is an increasing widening of history to get true world history gets wider and wider till we get to the big history. It indicates a direction or goal or outcome of history. We're not going into that in detail here, but this is something that all 3 that we're looking at have in common. So the first 2 items, Jaspers and Hegel and Christian have in common, explaining the dynamics within history and behind jumps to higher levels. They all 3 do that to some extent. Big history does it more completely. Pointing to challenges or tasks for today and tomorrow. For Hegel, that is a no-no. He's oriented on the past. Karl Jaspers does point to tasks for today, as does big history. The last one, seeking meaning in the process of change and driving forces behind those processes. This is something that big history is undeveloped. So here's that chart comparing. Yes, 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 of the first 2 all across the board. Hegel and Jaspers are partial compared to big history on the dynamics. Pointing to challenges for today, Hegel, no. The meaning and the driving forces, big history, undeveloped. These next 2 slides focus in on Hegel primarily, but we begin with the historian John Lewis Gaddis. This is the front cover of his book that features a painting by C.G. Friedrich, a romantic German artist, of, of, of a hiker looking over a vast prospect. And we see him from behind. How Historians Map the Past is the subtitle of this book. Mapping the past is something we should recognize from David Christian's book, The Maps of Time. This is a common, this is an analogy they have in common. But what Gaddis says is that this picture is very much like the professional historian whose back whose back is turned toward the artist and toward the audience, toward the future. We advance bravely into the future with our eyes fixed on the past. The image we present to the world is that of a rear end, the butt end history approach. The same is shared by Hegel, who says that we really have true understanding only of what is dead and gone. And that is the significance of the owl of Minerva. Minerva is the Roman god of wisdom, comparable to Athena. Historical wisdom is represented by an owl which can see only at night. So as an age is dying, as gray and gray appears, and death is spreading, and the age is ending, that is when understanding begins to take flight. And the darker it gets, the more we understand. The owl of Minerva takes its flight only when the shades of night are gathering. Do not try to apply his philosophy to going forward. And this is something that John Lewis Gaddis is pointing to as a sort of a problem with professional history. Now, as we look in on Hegel's idea of progress, it is reason guiding history forward toward the realization of freedom, and he uses this to judge history. And he talks about the Eastern nations, that is, most of the Asian part of Eurasia, and he handles them as if they preceded the Greek and Roman world, and said that they knew that one is free. The Greek and Romans came in the next step. Some are free, and then we, being Europe in the 19th century, especially the Germanic element, know that man absolutely is free. And this kind of freedom, though, and this progress is based on a dialectical movement, not the thesis, antithesis, synthesis of Marx, but of two opposing ideas whose deficiencies come together to form the synthesis moving forward, leading to the next stage. So, and the progress has been to full freedom realized in a social context, the state, this context of the state. For Thomas Kuhn, whose famous philosophy of revolutions actually follows a similar kind of approach, the old paradigms have holes in them, and through the holes emerge a revolution, a whole new structure, a whole new paragraph that leaps ahead, and you cannot anticipate that, but by looking backward, you see how it is an improvement, and you can anticipate there will be future paradigm shifts, but you cannot predict them. You can only understand them once they have happened. Moving now to look at axes as way of progress. When we look at what Karl Jaspers called the axial age, a period from 700 to 200 BCE, he said there was an age in which fundamental categories that we think in emerged in several civilizations, communicating with each other on those, and the common effect was to render religion ethical. It was a whole new awareness for human beings, comparable to the transformation of awareness by Adam and Eve, which did not change the world, but their awareness of themselves in the world. This was a breakthrough in quality that is not the equivalent to it jumps in complexity, because it is a mental awareness. And this is what Karen Armstrong builds on as well, by talking about the golden rule as what was common to people in those days. And she wants to return to appreciating the importance of changing as an axis of change. Now, looking at how they apply this to the present, we see that Jaspers was concerned about the disintegration that he saw intellectually in the world following World War II and in the 50s. He wants to return to the fountainhead of ideals that science and technology have undermined, he thought, leading to nihilism. And this leads to Karen Armstrong's emphasis on calling for a spiritual revolution that goes back to the golden rule, back to the axial age, or else we will not be able to save our planet, is the concern she has. Now, looking at quickly at David Christian, we see that he acknowledges the importance of spiritual psychological elements, but does not deal with them directly. The thresholds are major turning points that have to do with growing complexity. Now, Nancy Ellen Abrams is a scientist who, with her husband, has written on the double dark theory that 95% of the universe is dark matter and energy. And she says there we can see an emerging God that teaches us the meaning of good and evil. And we need to be looking into that. He says creationists speak to our deep spiritual psychic need and recognizes big history as a creation and a myth and cosmology of our time, but does not deal with that spiritual aspect. Well, Abrams says not having a spiritual life is like never really falling in love. So she's pointing strongly toward the need to pay attention to the spiritual dimension. So as we wrap up to stay within our time, we look at three questions. Is big history a philosophy of history? I think I have shown that in highlights, yes. Is it useful in identifying and acting on current problems? Yes. We are here today as a group unified through certain values of equality and inclusion, human rights. And we want to act on things like climate change. But no, also because we do not have a spiritual moral foundation for those values that we see in big history, emerging in big history. So we need more work in that area. So is there a hole? I'm not saying it's as big as this big blue hole here, but there is an undeveloped area. And I'm pointing to an area where we need to show more attention. And Karen Armstrong is one that I particularly would like to see us talk about more. And Nancy Ellen Abrams may be someone we need to learn more about and explore the implications of the science that she and her husband have worked on. So that brings me to the end of the highlights of my paper. I want to thank you so much for your attention. I hope you have enjoyed it, and I hope that we can meet in person next time.